Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. This is our fourth session of the National Tutoring Campaign. My name is Ahmed Sheikh, and I will be assisting you with grade 10 mathematics. Today's lesson is going to be based on statistics, and we are going to be focusing on the 5-number summary and analyzing of graphs. The lesson objectives are, by the end of the lesson, learners should be able to find the 5-number summary, to draw a box and whisker plot, and to use statistical summaries to interpret, analyze, and make meaningful comments on the context associated with the given data. Number 1, we're going to answer the exercise from the previous lesson so that learners may do their corrections. Number 2, you're going to collect, organize, and interpret univariate numerical data to determine the 5-number summary, the box and whisker diagrams, measures of dispersion to include range, percentiles, quartiles, interquartile range, and semi-interquartile range, as well as to use the statistical summaries to interpret, analyze, and make meaningful comments on the context associated with the given data. I've also uploaded the link for the worksheet that I'm going to be using during this lesson. There is an exercise after each part of that worksheet, and you guys can try it for yourselves. I've also uploaded 2 additional videos just to help you get a better understanding of this section. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so I'm going to pull up last week's questions, and this was the exercise that was given to you guys. So it says the following data is given. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 values. Okay, so remember, before we do work or do find any measures of central tendency or measures of dispersion, it's essential that we rearrange our data in ascending form, meaning from lowest to highest. So I've done that already, and this is what your data set should look like. So let's look at 1.1. 1.1 says to determine the range of the data. And going back to last week's lesson, we remember the range is the highest value minus the lowest value. So I'm going to enter that into my calculation. I've got 20 minus 0. And my answer for the range should be 20. Okay, let's look at 1.2. 1.2, determine the upper quartile, which is Q3 of the data. Now, remember, in last week's lesson, we were looking at a data set and we were separating it into 2 halves, meaning the lower half and the upper half. Q3 is the median of the upper half, and Q1 is the median of the lower half. So if I'm looking at this data set here, you can see I've got 10 values. So I'm going to highlight my first 5, which is my lower half, and then I'm going to highlight my second 5, which is my upper half. And that makes it a little bit easier for us to calculate whatever we need to find out. So in 1.2, we were asked to work out Q3, which is the median of the upper half. Now our formula is, it's the number of values in the lower half, which is 5, and n plus 1 over 2, meaning the number of values in the upper half plus 1 divided by 2. So we've got 5 values in our upper half. I'm going to enter that there. And 5. Let's put that into our calculator. So we've got 5 plus 1 divided by 2 plus 5. And that tells us that the 8th position is our Q3, or the upper quartile. And let's look at what our 8th position is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And that tells us that Q3 is equal to 15. Okay, so let's look at 1.3. 1.3 asks us to determine the lower quartile, Q1 of the data. So if we're looking at Q1, remember, is the median of the lower half. We've got 5 values in our lower half. So let's input that into our calculation. And it's equal to 5. So I've got 5 plus 1 divided by 2, and 5 plus 1 is 6 divided by 2, and that gives me an answer of 3. So that tells me that Q1 is equal to 1, 2, 3, 5. Okay, let's look at 1.4. 1.4 asks us to determine the interquartile range of the data. And if we can recall from last week's lesson, the interquartile range simply means Q3 minus Q1. So my Q3 value was 15. And my Q1 value was 5. And 15 minus 5 is equal to 10. And that should be your answer for 1.4. 1.5, determine the 70th percentile of the data. Remember, in order for us to calculate that, it's the percentile over 100 times the number of values in that data set. So let's put in our percentile. That's 70. And we already calculated how many values we have in this data set, which is 10. Let's work that out. And that tells us that the 7th position is our 70th percentile. And that equals to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 14. Okay, guys, that was your answers to the questions that were given to you in session 3. Hope you guys understood the calculations and how we attained our answers. Okay, we're now going to look at today's topic, which is the 5-number summary. Okay, let's look at that. So we've got the 5-number summary, and it tells us, it helps us to analyze the spread of data about the median. So the first number, or the first value of your 5-number summary, is called the minimum value. The minimum value simply means the lowest value of your data set. So if we're looking at this data set given to us in this example, the lowest value is 0, therefore your minimum is 0. We look at the second value of your 5-number system, and that should be a lower quartile, which is Q1. And Q1 is the lower half of the median, and it represents 25% of the data. If we're looking at this is a box and whisker diagram. And this represents the box and the arms represent the whiskers. So the right-hand side of your box represents Q1. And as you can see, they've calculated 3 to be the quartile for the lower quartile or Q1. The third number in your 5-number system is the median, which is Q2. And that is the value that divides the data in half, and that represents 50% of the data. Now, if you look at your box, you have a line that separates it into 2 parts, and that line will be in line with your Q2, which is your median. And they've calculated the value 7 to be the median in this example. If you look at the 4th number in the 5-number system, and that tells us it's the upper quartile, Q3. That means it's the upper half of the median, and that represents 75% of the data. And if you look at your right-hand side of the box, it should be in line with Q3, which is 11, and 11 was calculated for Q3 of this data set. And maximum value, which we've already explained, it is the second whisker of the box and whisker plot, and it's the last value or the highest value of the data. Okay, I've put together an example for you guys, and we'll answer that together so you guys can get a better understanding of what a box and whisker plot and the 5-number summary actually is. Okay, so we've got Tabo is recording how many times he can make a successful flip trick with his skateboard. The data represents 10 days of practicing. So remember, first thing we need to do to rearrange our data in ascending order, which I've done already, and that is what our data looks like. Let's look at the questions that were asked based on this data set. So we're looking at number 1. It says, determine the minimum value. Okay, going back to our example, minimum value, the lowest value of the data set. So let's look at our data set after rearranged, and we can see the lowest value there is in 11. Let's look at number 2, determine the maximum value. Remember, maximum value meaning the highest value in my data set. Let's look at our data set, and we can see that the highest value is 22. Number 3, calculate the lower quartile. Remember, if we're looking at our data set, the first 5 will be representing the lower half, and the second 5 will represent our upper half. Let's highlight that with another color. Okay. So that is, our median is going to lie in between position 5 and position 6. Anyhow, we were asked in number 3 to calculate the lower quartile. So we've got 5 values in our lower half. Let's put that into our formula. So we've got 5, which represents n plus 1 over 2. And 5 plus 1 is 6 divided by 2. And that tells us that position 3 is our lower quartile. And let's identify what position 3 is. 1, 2, and 3. And that tells us it's equal to 14. Let's look at number 4. Number 4 says to calculate the median Okay, our formula to calculate the median is n plus 1 over 2, n representing the number of values in our data set. So we've got 10 values there. So that's 10 plus 1 over 2, and that's 11 over 2, which equals to 5,5 position. And the 5.5 position will be between position 5 and position 6. So in order for us to calculate that, it's going to be okay. So let's look at position 5. It is 15, and position 6 is also 15. So that means it's going to be 15 plus 15 divided by 2. And that will equal to 15. So that tells us that our median here is 15. Remember that 15 is in between position 5 and position 6. Number 5 asks us to determine the upper quartile. Upper quartile, we have 5 values in our upper half, and we have 5 values in our lower half. In order for us to calculate Q3, it's going to be the 5 from our lower half, and then the 5 plus 1 in our upper half divided by 2. And that's 3 plus 5, which gives us the 8th position. And if we look at our 8th position, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, it tells us that it is the value 18. Okay, and our last question there is to draw a box and whisker plot of the above data. All we're going to do is we're going to take our 5-number summary, which we have already, and input it into our box and whisker. Again, coming back to the box and whisker plot, the first whisker represents Q1. The left-hand side of the rectangle represents, the first whisker represents the minimum. The left-hand side of the rectangle represents Q1. The center line of our rectangle represents Q2. The right-hand side of our rectangle represents Q3, and the last whisker represents the maximum value, which is the highest value of our data set. So let's input our values. So if we're looking at my minimum value, we've already calculated that, and it was 11. If we look at our maximum value, it's 22. Let's input that. And let's look at Q1. Q1 was equal to 14. Then we had the median, which is Q2, and that should equal to 15. And lastly, Q3, our upper quartile, which we calculated to be 18. And that, boys and girls, is basically a box and whisker plot. Okay, so there is an exercise which I've added to this worksheet. You guys can try it and answer these questions. It would give you a better understanding of the box and whisker plot and the 5-number summary. Okay, we're moving to the next part of our lesson, which is analyzing of graphs. So I've put together this histogram with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 intervals. And we can see each bar has a different frequency. Our first interval from 0 less than x equals to x less than 50 has a frequency of 16. We're looking at our second interval from 50 to 100 that has a frequency of 24. Our third interval has a frequency of 13. Our fourth interval from 150 to 200 has an interval of 10. Our fifth interval, which is 200 to 250, has an interval of 4. And our last interval from 250 to 300 has a frequency of 3. Okay, so let's look at the questions asked based on this histogram. Okay, so number 1 says to write down the modal class of the data. In order for us to determine the modal class, it is simply the bar with the highest frequency. And we can see that that interval has the highest frequency. So that tells us the interval of 50 that tells us that the interval from 50 less than equals to x, which is less than 100, is the modal class of this data set. Okay, let's look at question 2. Question 2 asks us to determine the mean of the total sale. Now, in order for us to calculate this, we need to complete our table, which is the adding our midpoint column and our frequency times midpoint column. Remember, that is the only way we can work out the total of our frequency times midpoint column. And that is how we calculate our estimated mean as well. So let's look at our table. So let's look at the frequency of our first interval from 0 to 50. It had a frequency of 16. Let's enter that in our frequency column. Our second interval from 50 to 100 had a frequency of 24. Let's enter that. The third interval had a frequency of 13. The fourth interval had a frequency of 10. Our fourth interval had a frequency of 4. And our last interval had a frequency of 3. Okay, now we're ready for action. Let's calculate our midpoints for each interval. So the first value of my interval is 0, and the last value is 50. 0 plus 50 divided by 2, and that should give me 25. Let's look at our second midpoint for the interval 50 to 100. Our first value is 50 plus our second value, which is 100, and 150 divided by 2 is 75. If you're looking at our third interval, the midpoint, the first value of my interval was 100, and the last value was 150, and 250 divided by 2 would give me 125. I'm looking at my fourth interval. My first value is 150, my last value is 200, and 350 divided by 2 would be 175. Okay, we're looking at the fifth interval, and my first value is 200. The second value is 250, and 200 plus 250 is 450. 450 divided by 2 would give me 225. My last interval, if I'm calculating the midpoint, the first value is 250 plus the last value of 300, and 250 plus 300 is 550, and that gives me a midpoint of 275. Okay, let's enter our values into the frequency times midpoint. Remember, it's going to be midpoint for each interval. So let's start with the first one. We've got 16 times 25. We work out our answers just now. Let's enter our values first. Our second interval, we've got 24 times 75. Our third interval, we've got a frequency of 13 times a midpoint of 125. Our fourth interval, we have a frequency of 10 times a midpoint of 175. Our fifth interval, we have a frequency of 4 times a midpoint of 225. And our last interval, we have a frequency of 3 multiplied by a midpoint of 275. Okay. Let's work out our frequency times midpoint answers. So our first calculation is going to be 16 times 25, and that gives us a frequency times midpoint answer of 400. If you're looking at our second frequency times midpoint, it's 24 times 75, and that gives us 1,800. Our third frequency times midpoint, our calculation is 13 times 125, and that gives us an answer of 1625. If you're looking at our fourth frequency times midpoint, our calculation is 10 times 175, and that gives us an answer of 1750. Our fifth frequency times midpoint, it's 4 times 225, and that equals to 900. And our last interval is 3 times 275, and that equals to 825. Okay, so let's add up our frequency times midpoint. Our question asks us to determine the mean of the total sales. So they do not want us to calculate the estimated mean, rather they want us to calculate the total amount of the sales made for that given period. So we're looking at 400 plus 1,800 plus 1625 plus 1750 plus 900 plus 825. And that gives us a total of 7,300. Remember, we're working with money, boys and girls, so 7,300 rand. And that was your answer for question 2. Okay. I've also uploaded a exercise here for you guys. There's 2 questions based on graphs as well. Remember, we're going to be answering that in our next week's session. So please try and do that before Saturday. Okay, before we part ways, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about a terminology or concept called priority. Okay, I'd like to speak to you a little bit about a concept, a terminology called priority. Remember, boys and girls, we are going to be writing our September control test in the near future, should be next week or the following week, and revision is very essential for us to start with. Some of us have started with it, though there are many of us who have not. Prioritizing your work before anything else is very important at this stage or this moment in time. You got to understand that if you do not do your revision, you're not going to understand your work, and it's not going to be a good outcome for you. You're obviously not going to get the marks that you would like or the marks that you would want. Now, with regards to priority, you got to understand that work comes before play. And when I say play, I'm talking about choosing not to work, for example, maybe on your social media or watching television, whatever the case is. You got to understand that right now you need to be focusing more on your work rather than relaxing and having fun. With that being said, boys and girls, do take care, and until next week, goodbye.